Hello everyone, I'm Crow77, and today we're taking a look at the beginnings of defense. Specifically, we're going to go over the three basic types of defensive play. I'll go through a few examples of what discards to make in different situations based on these initial principles. Later on in the defense discussion series, we'll delve into even more complex theories of defense beyond just these initial concepts. The first type of defense is what many people think of when they consider defense in Mahjong. It's called Betaori. This is when you're completely defending and only trying not to deal into someone else's hand, with no regard to your own hand whatsoever. The second type is Mawashi, also known by its full name, Mawashi. This is a sort of partial defense. You'll take more risks than Betaori, but overall you're still trying to take care to reduce your chances of dealing into someone else's hand, sometimes taking a step back in order to do so. The third type is Zentsu, also known as Zentsu. This is when you completely throw caution to the winds and focus solely on completing your own hand. While many people view this aggression as opposed to defense, the application of it does not always mean that's true. Players have a tendency to look mainly for genbutsu tiles when they Betaori, focusing on tiles that other players have discarded after a reach, for example. However, there's much more to consider. Kabe, or when you can see all four of a tile, is extremely important as well. It can create tiles that are completely safe, or that are only safe as a rearmament weight, depending on the situation. Secondly, Nakasuji is safer than regular Suji when you're looking at defense like this. Players are a lot less likely to have a hand such as 4-6 waiting on a 5, compared to 8-9 waiting on a 7. Players will be much more hesitant to reach the first option, as the likelihood that someone will need to discard a 5 is going to be a lot lower. And speaking of safety of Suji, typically an early Suji tile will be better basis for a decision than a later one. It doesn't always hold true, of course, but people are very unlikely to choose to set up a Suji trap very early on. For example, consider the shape 5-7-9. It can be filled with a 6 or an 8, so you typically want to hold on to a round count like that. But when someone reaches, they'd likely drop the 5, creating a somewhat weak Suji trap, with 5 being Suji to the 8. Just remember that tiles discarded closer to the reach or tenpai follow this kind of pattern much more often. We'll go over more concepts like that in future videos. Lastly, make sure you defend against everyone at the table, instead of just the one that looks the most dangerous. Tunnel visioning like that can lead into a lot of trouble if you suddenly have no safe tiles when someone else declares a reach. In addition, players are much more likely to try to shape their hand to win off of a tile that's been discarded by someone who's reached. Doing this increases win percentage significantly, especially if they have a Dama hand as well. But you also need to consider the future. In general, that means you should discard the most dangerous safe tile in your hand when you think only one person is tenpai and you're deciding to Betaori. It's kind of a really weird term, but let's say you have a 5, 9, and red dragon in your hand that are all safe against someone who reached. In general, you want to discard the 5 there first. That way you have the typically safer terminal tile and honor tile to defend later, if other players do become tenpai. So let's take a look at this hand. We have a significant lead on score, our hand doesn't have much value, and is still a few steps from tenpai. This is a classic example of when you would often want to Betaori. But anytime it looks like multiple players could be in tenpai, it can be pretty hard to do so. At this point, the player across from us looks pretty likely to be tenpai, and the players to our left and right have both recently declared reach. So we have to consider all the players' discards to figure out what the safest tiles will be. The first discard's pretty easy. We can see to our left that the 9-so just passed, so we would mirror that and discard it as well. A tile that was just discarded by the player to our left is always 100% safe against dealing in against every player. The problem is thinking ahead and figuring out what we'll be doing with future turns. The good news is the 3 9-pins we have in our hand. It makes it a lot less likely that any player is holding 8-9 pin. That means that since the reach tile to our right is an Akadora, the 7 pin is much safer. If that player had 8-6 pin left in hand, they likely would have discarded the 8 pin instead, to have an open weight and an extra Dora. It's also Suji to the discard to our left, and Genbutsu to the player across from us. So unless something else comes up, it will most likely be our best discard with how the board is. This is the sort of logic you want to be looking at every turn when you're playing defense. You never want to go on autopilot and not think through a turn like this. Mawashi may be the trickiest of these options. The most important thing is not to trick yourself into thinking that you must continue to Mawashi. You need to constantly reevaluate the position. A lot of this reevaluation is just your standard push-fold judgment. Just remember to make that same judgment that you make on the first turn of someone's Reach on the 10th turn of it as well. If the board state has become more dangerous, for example if someone declares a con into someone else's Reach, it may not be worth risking anything anymore, and instead choosing to Betaori. Similarly, if you draw an Akadora that significantly increases the value of your hand, it might make sense to Zentsu instead. When put to the test, a lot of players have the tendency to say things like, this tile is not that dangerous, when they have a hand that could be high value, or are very close to or are in Tenpai. That's a tendency you need to be able to overcome to properly evaluate Mawashi. So let's start with this basic example right here. We'll ignore the hands of the players to our left and right just for the sake of simplicity. We can see that our hand is very strong, as it's a Honitsu hand and could easily be worth about 12,000 points. Normally in a situation where you're playing to make the highest value hand you can, you discard the one-so, as it doesn't help out with this hand at all, and the Chun might make sense to switch out for the North Wind if we draw a pair of them. However, in this situation, the one-so is not safe at all. So we would most likely want to Mawashi this hand by discarding the Chun. If we draw into Tenpai, that's where we'd have to determine if we'd want to continue to simply push the hand or try to Mawashi, maybe by discarding a pair of winds. And lastly, let's talk a bit about Zentsu. It may be an odd one for some of you to see in this video. As we talked about, a lot of people think that Zentsu is more of an aggressive play. Consider this situation though. You're in 3rd place in South 4, with 4,000 points separating you and last place. You have a decent starting hand, but the person in last place declares a Reach on their first turn. If you sit around and play defensively, and they draw it themselves, they certainly overtake you. With any other Dora or Yaku or on a Ron, they overtake as well. This is the only real option that you have, is to push to deny their hand, which I would consider a more defensive move. There's a few more situations where it can make sense as well. If you have almost no safe tiles in your hand but are Tenpai for a 1,000 point hand, for example, it can make sense not to take apart your hand and instead push to deny the hand. How about this one? What's your strategy here? This is one of those classic examples, choosing kind of between Betaori and Zentsu. We can't really Mawashi because any discard that is safe really takes apart our hand, which makes it a lot less likely that we'll be able to rebuild it. In this situation, because we can see 3 of each to the 4 and 7, it's significantly harder to use the 6-pin, although it's a little bit suspicious that we don't see any 6s yet. So I went ahead and decided to Zentsu, discarding the 6-pin. If you were to Betaori instead, 1 pin would probably be the best tile to start with, but the main problem is you run out of safe tiles very, very quickly. The 2 and 3 pin don't look completely awful, but if those are your follow-up options after dealing the 1 pin, I feel like it's better to take the risk now and deal the 6 pin while maintaining chances to win in the hand. As always, thanks for watching. I look forward to reading all your ideas, especially on that last decision. Stay tuned for more in the Defense Discussion series. See you next time.